On a sweltering July afternoon in 1988, the richest woman in America was on her knees, begging the universe for a miracle that money couldn't buy. High on a Manhattan penthouse terrace, Gloria Vanderbilt, the Queen of Jeans, the last survivor of the Gilded Age, watched in horror as her 23-year-old son climbed onto the ledge. She had survived 4 marriages, a toxic childhood, and the scrutiny of the world. She was supposed to be invincible, but in one terrifying second she watched her son let go and plunge 14 stories to the pavement. This is the story of how a woman shattered by the ultimate tragedy gathered the pieces of her broken life and refused to die. But the darkness had been waiting for her since the nursery. We must scrub away the designer denim and the society balls and go back to the original sin of the Vanderbilt dynasty. We must go back to a time before the fall, to a nursery in the 1920s where little girls sat alone, waiting for a mother who was always just out of reach. Gloria Laura Vanderbilt was born in 1924, a child of the Jazz Age, delivered into a family that was less a lineage and more a corporation. To be a Vanderbilt in the early 20th century was to be American royalty. Her great-great-grandfather, Cornelius the Commodore Vanderbilt, had built an empire of steamships and railroads that had essentially constructed the infrastructure of the modern United States. He was a man of iron will and ruthless ambition. But by 1924, the iron had rusted. The Vanderbilt fortune, once the largest concentration of wealth in human history, had been diluted by generations of spendthrifts, playboys, and social climbers. The dynasty was in its decadent phase. They were building mansions they couldn't afford to heat and marrying European aristocrats to buy titles they didn't need. Gloria's father was Reginald Claypool Vanderbilt. He was the archetype of the dissolute heir. A heavy drinker and a gambler, Reginald had burned through millions of dollars by the time he was 40. He was a man who lived for the racetrack and the bottle, a soft man in a hard world. Her mother was Gloria Morgan. If the Vanderbilts were the establishment, Gloria Morgan was the new dangerous energy of the 1920s. She was a teenage beauty, one half of the magical Morgans. She and her twin sister Thelma were international sensations, extraordinarily beautiful, socially ambitious, and utterly penniless. They were the original It Girls. Thelma would go on to become the mistress of the Prince of Wales, and Gloria Morgan set her sights on Vanderbilt. When they married, it was the wedding of the season, but the union was doomed by biology and economics. Reginald was dying. His liver, assaulted by years of Prohibition-era liquor, was failing. He died in 1925 when little Gloria was just 18 months old. The death of Reginald Vanderbilt revealed a shocking financial reality. He had spent almost everything. There was no vast fortune left for his widow. He died insolvent. However, there was a catch. A $5 million trust fund had been set up for his child, little Gloria. The money belonged exclusively to the baby. Gloria Morgan, the mother, received nothing, not a dime. This economic disparity set the stage for the most grotesque public spectacle of the Depression era. The mother was penniless. The toddler was a millionaire. To survive, to maintain the lifestyle of a socialite, Gloria Morgan had to become the employee of her own daughter. She had to petition the courts for an allowance to raise the child. Little Gloria became the bank. She was the golden goose, and like all golden geese, she was kept in a cage. The first 10 years of Gloria Vanderbilt's life were a study in luxurious neglect. Her mother, terrified of the judgmental eyes of the Vanderbilt clan in New York, took the child and fled to Europe. They became nomads of the high society circuit. Imagine the life of this child. She grew up in the suites of the Ritz in Paris, the hotels of London, the villas of the French Riviera. She traveled with 40 trunks of Louis Vuitton luggage. She wore silk dresses and handmade shoes, but she had no home, she had no father, and for all intents and purposes, she had no mother. Gloria Morgan was a creature of the night. She slept until noon behind blackout curtains. She spent her afternoons at fittings and her nights at parties that lasted until dawn. She was young, beautiful, and widowed, and she intended to live. She moved through a world of princes, playboys, and deposed royalty. Little Gloria was an accessory. She was brought out for photo opportunities, told to curtsy, and then sent back to her room. She was a piece of luggage that had to be stamped at every border crossing to ensure the flow of the allowance checks. But in the absence of a mother, Gloria found a savior. Her name was Emma Kieslish, but Gloria called her Dodo. Dodo was the nurse. She was a German Catholic woman of fierce protective instincts. In the vacuum of affection that was Gloria's childhood, Dodo became the entire world. She slept in the same room as the child. She fed her, she dressed her, she told her stories. She shielded her from the chaos of her mother's life. But Dodo was also a source of fear. She whispered to Gloria that her mother was bad. She told the child that the Vanderbilts were watching, that they were powerful, and that one day there would be a reckoning. She instilled in Gloria a sense of impending doom, a feeling that this floating world of hotels and champagne was fragile and could shatter at any moment. And Dodo was right. Back in New York, the Vanderbilt establishment was indeed watching, and they were disgusted. The head of the opposition was Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney. Gertrude was Gloria's aunt, Reginald's sister. She was a woman of immense power and wealth. She was not a frivolous socialite. She was a serious artist, a sculptor, and the founder of the Whitney Museum of American Art. She was a woman of the old school, stoic, moralistic, and fiercely protective of the family name. Gertrude received reports from private detectives and gossiping friends in Europe. She heard stories about Gloria Morgan's behavior. She heard about the parties. She heard about the Prince of Wales. She heard rumors of a relationship between Gloria Morgan and the Marchioness of Milford Haven, a hint of lesbianism that in the 1930s was considered not just a scandal, but a sign of moral depravity. To Gertrude, this was unacceptable. A Vanderbilt heir was being raised by a loose woman in a Europe that was drifting toward fascism and war. The child was being corrupted. The money was being wasted. In 1934, the catalyst arrived. Little Gloria, frail and sickly, developed chronic tonsillitis. The doctors in Europe recommended surgery. Gloria Morgan, perhaps tired of the nomadic life or perhaps running low on funds, brought the child back to New York for the operation. They stayed at a hotel, but Gertrude made an offer. "Let the child stay with me at my estate in Old Westbury," she said. "The air is better, the food is better. She can recover in peace." It seemed like a kind offer. Gloria Morgan, eager for her own freedom in the city, agreed. She handed her daughter over to the aunt. She didn't know it, but she had just walked into a trap. The Whitney estate in Old Westbury, Long Island, was a fortress. It was a world of manicured lawns, high stone walls, and silent servants. It was the American equivalent of Downton Abbey, but colder. When little Gloria arrived, she was overwhelmed. She had spent her life in hotels. She didn't know what a home was. Here, everything was permanent. There were portraits of ancestors staring down from the walls, ancestors who looked like her father. Gertrude began a campaign of seduction. She gave Gloria a pony. She gave her a room filled with toys. She gave her stability. And Dodo, the nurse, was there, whispering in Gloria's ear, "Your aunt loves you. Your mother doesn't want you. You are safe here." Weeks turned into months. Gloria Morgan would drive out from the city to visit, but the visits were awkward. The child was distant, the aunt was cold. Whenever Gloria Morgan tried to take her daughter back, Gertrude had an excuse. She's still weak. The doctor says she needs country air. Let her stay the summer. Finally, the summer ended. Gloria Morgan demanded her daughter back. Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney refused. She locked the gates. She filed a petition in the Surrogates Court of New York. She alleged that Gloria Morgan was an unfit mother, morally depraved and negligent. She sued for full custody of the child in control of the $5 million trust. The war had begun. The news broke in September 1934. It was an atomic explosion in the press. You have to understand the context of the time. The United States was in the darkest depth of the Great Depression. 25% of the workforce was unemployed. People were starving in the streets. The Dust Bowl was ravaging the West. And here on the front pages of the newspapers were two impossibly wealthy women fighting over a child who had more money in her piggy bank than a small town earned in a decade. It was obscene, and it was irresistible. The press dubbed it the trial of the century. They called Gloria the poor little rich girl. It was a real-life fairy tale twisted into a horror story. It had everything: royalty, lesbians, money, kidnapping, and a beautiful, weeping mother. Little Gloria was 10 years old. She was a shy, stuttering child with a nervous stomach. She loved to draw. She loved her nurse. She was terrified of the dark. Suddenly, she was the most famous child on the planet. She was trapped in the Whitney mansion, surrounded by lawyers who coached her day and night. They told her what to say. They told her that her mother wanted to take her away and spend all her money. They told her that if she went back to her mother, she would be poor. They told her that her mother might kill her. The psychological pressure exerted on this 10-year-old girl was a form of torture. She was forced to choose between the mother who had given her birth and the aunt who was giving her a pony. But it wasn't really a choice. It was an indoctrination. As the court date approached, the atmosphere in New York City became feverish. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse chanting for Gloria. But which Gloria? The mother or the daughter? Inside the courtroom, the air was thick with the smell of wet wool and stale tobacco. The judge, Justice John Francis Carew, was a man of the old school, ill-equipped to handle the emotional violence that was about to be unleashed. Gloria Morgan arrived in court dressed in black, looking like a tragic widow. Gertrude Vanderbilt. Whitney arrived wrapped in furs, looking like a queen, and somewhere in the back, kept in a judge's chamber, sat the child. She sat on a hard wooden chair, her feet dangling, clutching a doll. She was waiting for her turn to speak. She was waiting to destroy her mother. The curtain was rising on the tragedy that would define Gloria Vanderbilt's life. She was about to learn the brutal lesson that in the world of the super rich, love is a commodity and family is a blood sport. The trial would strip her of her privacy, her innocence, and her name. It would leave a hole in her soul that no amount of money could fill. But as she sat there, listening to the muffled shouting from the courtroom, she did not know that she was also forging the steel that would one day save her. She was a victim now, yes, but she was a Vanderbilt. And Vanderbilts do not die easy. But resilience is a muscle that must be torn before it can grow. And the tearing of Gloria Vanderbilt was about to become a public spectator sport. As the trial reached its crescendo, the courtroom ceased to be a place of law and became a theater of cruelty, where a child would be asked to perform the ultimate act of betrayal against her own blood. The lawyers had prepped her, the aunt had coached her, and the press was waiting for the kill. The little girl sitting in the antechamber was about to walk through a door that would lock the past behind her forever, trading her innocence for a verdict that would save her fortune but starve her heart. The doors of the judge's chambers opened, and a hush fell over the packed courtroom. It was the silence of a crowd waiting for an execution. Little Gloria, 10 years old, walked out. She was pale, her eyes wide and dark, looking like a porcelain doll that had been dropped and glued back together slightly wrong. She climbed onto the witness stand. Her legs were too short, they dangled above the floor. She looked at the sea of faces, the reporters with their pencils poised, the society matrons in their hats, the judge in his black robe. And then she looked at her mother. Gloria Morgan sat at the defense table, clutching a handkerchief, her face a mask of terrified hope. The judge asked the child who she wanted to live with. The answer had been rehearsed for weeks. It had been drilled into her by the lawyers, by her grandmother, by the aunt who promised her ponies and safety. "I want to live with my Aunt Gertrude," the child said, her voice barely a whisper. And then the dagger. "I'm afraid of my mother." It was a lie. Or perhaps in the confused, traumatized mind of a child who had been told repeatedly that her mother was bad, it had become a temporary truth. But the effect was immediate. Gloria Morgan collapsed into sobs. The press went wild. The flashbulbs popped like gunfire. With that single sentence, Gloria Vanderbilt severed her own childhood. Justice Carew ruled in favor of the aunt. Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney was granted custody. The mother was granted visitation rights so restricted they were insulting. She could see her daughter on weekends, but she could not be alone with her. She was effectively fired from the job of being a mother. But the cruelty of the court was not finished. The judge ordered that Dodo, the beloved nurse, the only source of warmth in Gloria's life, be fired immediately. The court viewed Dodo's influence as poisonous. The scene of their separation is one of the most harrowing in the Vanderbilt archives. When they came to take Dodo away, little Gloria became hysterical. She screamed. She clung to the nurse's skirts. She had to be physically peeled away by the servants. As Dodo was dragged out the door, Gloria realized the terrifying truth of her new life. She was now the property of the Whitney estate. She had won the ponies, but she had lost the love. Life at the old Westbury estate was a study in Gothic isolation. Gertrude Vanderbilt. Whitney was not a cruel woman in the sadistic sense, but she was cold. She was an artist, a sculptor who spent her days in her studio in Greenwich Village, leaving Gloria alone in the vast mansion with a retinue of servants and bodyguards. Gloria became the poor little rich girl in the truest sense. She had everything money could buy: clothes, toys, tutors, except a touch. She grew up surrounded by armed guards because the Lindbergh kidnapping had happened just 2 years prior, and the family was terrified that Gloria would be snatched for ransom. She was a prisoner of her own value. In this vacuum, Gloria retreated inward. She began to keep diaries. She began to draw. She created a fantasy world where she was not a Vanderbilt, but a normal girl with a normal mother. She developed a stutter. She developed a nervous stomach. She became a watcher, observing the adults around her with a level of scrutiny that was unnerving. She learned to read the temperature of a room instantly. She learned that safety meant silence. Her mother, Gloria Morgan, became a ghost. She would visit on the allotted days, but the visits were excruciating. They sat in formal drawing rooms, making polite conversation under the watchful eyes of Gertrude's spies. The bond was broken. The mother drifted into a twilight existence, living off a small allowance, fading into the background of New York society, a tragic figure in faded silk. By the time Gloria turned 17 in 1941, the air in the Whitney mansion had become unbreathable. The United States was on the brink of World War II, and Gloria was on the brink of rebellion. She dropped out of school. She was beautiful now, a dark, exotic beauty that owed more to her mother's Spanish blood than the Vanderbilt stodginess. She had the Vanderbilt eyes, slanted, feline, unreadable. She went to visit her mother in Los Angeles. It was supposed to be a short trip, but Gloria saw the sun, the palm trees, and the lack of iron gates, and she decided she wasn't going back. Hollywood in the 1940s was a fever dream of glamour. Gloria, with her name and her face, was instant royalty. She was courted by movie stars. She was photographed at the Trocadero. And she met Pasquale Pat DiCicco. Pat DiCicco was an agent, a man about town, and a figure of shadowy repute. He was rumored to be connected to the mob. He was older, rougher, and dangerous. To Gertrude, he was a nightmare. To Gloria, he was a getaway car. She married him in 1941. She was 17, he was 32. The wedding was a media circus. Gloria thought she was marrying a protector, a strong man who would stand between her and her aunt. She was wrong. She had traded a cold cage for a violent one. DiCicco was abusive. He was a man who believed a wife was a possession. He famously told her, "I'm the star here." When she tried to speak her mind, he would silence her. There were stories of him banging her head against the wall. He called her fats to undermine her confidence. He married her for the Vanderbilt cachet, but he resented her for it. The marriage lasted 4 years. It was a crucible, but it forged something in Gloria. She realized that she was tough. She realized that she could endure pain, and she realized that the only way to survive a bully was to walk away. In 1945, she divorced him. She was 21 years old. She had access to her trust fund now. She was free, wealthy, and alone. But Gloria Vanderbilt was not designed for solitude. She craved a container. She craved a father. Almost immediately after leaving DiCicco, she met Leopold Stokowski. Stokowski was a legend. He was the conductor of the Philadelphia Orchestra, the man who had shaken hands with Mickey Mouse in Fantasia. He was 63 years old, 42 years her senior. He was flamboyant, brilliant, and utterly self-absorbed. He had a mane of white hair and a hypnotic accent that no one could quite place. The press mocked the union. They called it Beauty and the Beast. They said she was looking for a daddy, and they were right. Gloria was looking for the father she had lost to the bottle in 1925. But Stokowski offered her something DiCicco never did: respect. He saw her mind. He saw her artistic potential. He didn't want a trophy. He wanted a muse. They married in 1945. Stokowski took her away from the nightclubs and the gossip columns. They moved to a remote house in the mountains. He instituted a regime of silence and art. He encouraged her to paint. He taught her about music, about discipline, about the sublime. For 10 years, Gloria played the role of the maestro's wife. She had 2 sons with him, Stan and Chris. She kept his house. She sat in the front row at his concerts, looking adoringly at his back. It was a peaceful life, a life of high culture and deep thought. But it was also a performance. Gloria was still a child playing house, this time in the home of a benevolent God. Stokowski was controlling in his own way. He managed her money. He managed her time. He was the sun, and she was the moon, reflecting his light. By the mid-1950s, the quiet wife archetype was beginning to crack. The culture was shifting. Women were starting to ask questions. Gloria was in her 30s now. She was no longer the frightened girl from the courtroom. She was a mother, an artist, and a woman of independent means. She began to feel the itch of her own ambition. Painting in the attic wasn't enough. She wanted to be seen. She wanted to act. She started taking acting classes in New York. She appeared in television dramas like Playhouse 90. She published a book of poetry. Stokowski, sensing that his muse was waking up and preparing to walk off the pedestal, became distant. The marriage withered, not from hate, but from the inevitable friction of 2 egos occupying the same space. In 1955, she left him. This was the pivotal moment of her adult life. She wasn't leaving for another man. She was leaving for herself. She moved back to New York City. New York in the late 1950s and early 1960s was the capital of the world. It was the era of breakfast at Tiffany's, of the Stork Club, of elegance as a blood sport. Gloria entered this world not as an interloper, but as a queen returning from exile. She reconnected with her childhood friend Truman Capote. Capote was then at the height of his powers. He was the court jester to the high society ladies. He called his swans Babe Paley, Slim Keith, CZ Guest. These were women who had married vast fortunes and devoted their lives to perfection. They were immaculate, untouchable, and often deeply unhappy. Gloria moved in their orbit, but she was different. Capote noticed it. While Babe Paley was defined by her husband Bill Paley, Gloria was defined by her name. She was the Vanderbilt. She didn't need to marry money. She was money. And unlike the swans, who were terrified of scandal, Gloria had been born in it. She had a toughness they lacked. Capote admired her. He saw her as a survivor. He included her in his inner circle, listening to her stories, storing them away in his venomous memory bank. It was during this period that she married her third husband, Sidney Lumet. Lumet was the director of The Moment, the man behind 12 Angry Men. He was intense, Jewish, intellectual, and completely different from the waspish world of the Vanderbilts or the European aristocracy of Stokowski. He was New York energy personified. The marriage to Lumet was Gloria's intellectual period. She surrounded herself with writers and actors. She wasn't just a socialite, she was a serious person. But Lumet was a workaholic, married to the cinema. And Gloria, carrying the deep wounds of her abandonment, needed a level of attention that he could not provide. They divorced amicably, a rare thing in her life. By 1963, Gloria Vanderbilt was nearly 40. She had been the child victim, the mobster's wife, the maestro's muse, and the director's partner. She had lived 4 lives, but she still hadn't found the one thing she testified about in that courtroom in 1934, a home. She was tired of playing roles. She wanted to take off the costume. She wanted to find a man who didn't want a Vanderbilt, but just wanted Gloria. And in a crowded room in New York, she saw him. He wasn't a legend. He wasn't a genius. He was a writer from Mississippi with a soft accent and kind eyes. His name was Wyatt Cooper, and he was about to give her the only decade of pure happiness she would ever know. But as Gloria knew better than anyone, happiness in the Vanderbilt script is usually just the setup for the next act of tragedy. Throughout these years of marriages and reinventions, there was a shadow that followed Gloria. It wasn't her mother, who died in 1965, largely estranged from her daughter. It was Dodo. Years after the trial, an adult Gloria tracked down her old nurse. She found Dodo living in poverty, broken by the separation. The reunion was heartbreaking. Dodo still viewed Gloria as her baby, her charge. Gloria supported Dodo for the rest of her life, paying her bills, trying to buy back the love that the court had stolen. But the damage was done. The trauma of that separation, the screaming, the dragging away, remained the primal wound of Gloria's psyche. It made her a mother who was terrified of losing her own children, a woman who held on to her sons with a grip that was fierce, protective, and perhaps driven by the terror that the men in black robes would come back to take them away. By 1963, Gloria Vanderbilt was a woman composed of shards. She was the cracked doll of the custody trial, the bruised wife of the mobster, and the discarded muse of the maestro. She had moved through the first half of her life like a ghost in her own biography, haunting the mansions of men who viewed her as an acquisition. She was wealthy, yes, and famous, but she was fundamentally homeless. She carried the poor little rich girl label like a terminal diagnosis, and then into this life of high-stakes drama and low-grade despair walked a man who spoke softly and carried no stick. His name was Wyatt Cooper. He was a screenwriter and magazine editor from a small town in Mississippi. He didn't have a title. He didn't have a baton. He didn't have a mob connection. What he had was a profound, unshakable decency. He was handsome, with the kind of open, honest face that the Vanderbilt set usually regarded with suspicion. When they met, Gloria was bracing for another performance. She was used to men who wanted Gloria Vanderbilt. Wyatt Cooper just wanted Gloria. He wasn't intimidated by her history. He was moved by it. He saw the frightened 10-year-old girl hiding behind the couture, and instead of trying to fix her or exploit her, he simply offered to hold her hand. They married on Christmas Eve, 1963. It was a quiet rebellion against the pageantry of her past weddings. There were no paparazzi swarms, no press releases, just two people standing in the rain, making a promise. The 15 years that followed were the anomaly in the Vanderbilt script. They were happy. For the first time in her life, Gloria Vanderbilt was part of a family that wasn't at war. Wyatt Cooper was a hands-on father, a concept that was alien to Gloria's Victorian upbringing. They had two sons, Carter Vanderbilt Cooper, born in 1965, and Anderson Hayes Cooper, born in 1967. They created a domestic world that was a masterpiece of livable glamour. They bought a townhouse in Manhattan and a summer home in Southampton. But unlike the cold, museum-like halls of her Aunt Gertrude's estate, Gloria's homes were filled with color, quilts, and children. She decorated with a manic, joyous intensity, covering walls in patchwork fabrics, painting floors, creating a nest that felt safe. Wyatt was the anchor. He smoothed out her anxieties. He dealt with the accountants. He managed the social calendar. He gave her the space to be a mother. Friends described them as a single organism. They were never apart. For Gloria, who had been abandoned by her father and her mother, Wyatt was the corrective experience. He was the proof that love didn't have to hurt. But happiness, in the narrative of Gloria Vanderbilt, always feels like the setup for a punchline. In late 1977, Wyatt began to feel unwell. He was only 50 years old, vibrant, active, in the prime of his life. But the Cooper men had weak hearts. A checkup revealed a serious issue. He needed open heart surgery. It was supposed to be routine. On January 5, 1978, Gloria walked him to the hospital. They were optimistic. They had plans for the future. They had books to write and sons to raise. The surgery went wrong. Wyatt Cooper died on the operating table. The shock was total. It was a hammer blow that cracked the foundation Gloria had spent 15 years building. She was 53 years old. She was a widow. And she was alone with two young boys. Carter was 12, Anderson was 10, who had just lost the center of their universe. The poor little rich girl curse had struck again. Everyone she loved left, her father, her mother, Dodo, and now Wyatt. In the aftermath of Wyatt's death, Gloria faced a terrifying reality. It wasn't just the grief, it was the math. The Vanderbilt fortune was a myth. The $5 million she had inherited in 1925 had been diluted by taxes, bad investments, and the sheer cost of living like a Vanderbilt for half a century. She was house poor. She had valuable real estate and a famous name, but very little cash flow. And she had two sons to educate and a lifestyle to maintain. Most women in her position would have done what the Swans did. Marry a banker, marry a hedge fund manager, find a wallet with a pulse. But Gloria Vanderbilt was done with being a dependent. She looked at her life and realized that the only person who was going to save her was herself. She needed to make money, real money, In the late 1970s, the fashion world was undergoing a seismic shift. The designer jean craze was just beginning to bubble. Denim, once the uniform of the gold miner and the hippie, was being elevated to a luxury item. A textile company from India, the Mirjani Corporation, was looking for a name to attach to a new line of jeans fit for women. They didn't want a cowboy, they wanted class. They approached Gloria. It seemed like a mismatch, the heiress and the work pant. But Gloria understood the assignment perfectly. She knew that in America, class is fluid. People wanted to buy a piece of the dream. They couldn't afford a Vanderbilt mansion, but they could afford a pair of Vanderbilt pants. She didn't just license her name, she designed the product. She insisted that the jeans be dark, slimming, and free of the heavy masculine stitching that defined Levi's. She wanted them to be feminine. She embroidered her signature, Gloria Vanderbilt, on the back pocket, and on the front coin pocket, she placed her personal logo, a swan. It was a brilliant, subversive wink. Truman Capote had called her generation the Swans. Now she was taking that symbol of elite, untouchable leisure and stamping it onto the most democratic garment in the world. She was selling the swan to the masses. The launch of Gloria Vanderbilt jeans in 1978 was a cultural phenomenon. A $10 million advertising blitz saturated the airwaves. Commercials featured Gloria herself, slender, elegant, aristocratic, promising that the jeans would flatter a woman's body in a way no ordinary denim ever had. It worked beyond anyone's wildest dreams. The jeans sold out instantly. Women fought over them in department stores. At its peak in the early 1980s, the brand was generating hundreds of millions of dollars in annual sales. Gloria Vanderbilt was suddenly everywhere. She was on billboards, on buses, on the covers of magazines. She wasn't just an heiress anymore. She was a tycoon. She was making more money in a year than her father had spent in his lifetime. She bought a new townhouse on East 67th Street. She secured her son's futures. She proved to the ghost of her Aunt Gertrude that a Vanderbilt could actually earn a living. But there was a strange dissociation in this success. To the public, Gloria Vanderbilt became a brand, a pair of pants, a bottle of perfume. The woman behind the name began to fade into the logo. She was living inside a commercial, and while the money poured in, the shadow in her home was growing. Of her two sons, Anderson Cooper was the scrappy one, the survivor. He looked like Wyatt, wary, observant, tough. But Carter was the angel. Carter was the gentle one. He had the Vanderbilt sensitivity. He was brilliant, soft-spoken, and deeply attached to his mother. He graduated from Princeton. He wrote book reviews. He had a golden future ahead of him. But those who knew the family saw the cracks. Carter had taken his father's death harder than anyone. He carried a melancholy that he couldn't shake. He was a young man who felt things too deeply. While Anderson channeled his grief into action, Carter channeled his grief inward. As the 1980s roared on, a decade of excess cocaine and greed, Gloria and her sons lived in a tight, protective bubble in the penthouse on East 67th Street. It was a sanctuary, but sanctuaries can become prisons if you don't let the air in. By the summer of 1988, Carter was 23 years old. He had recently broken up with a girlfriend. He was struggling with his career direction. He began to complain of insomnia. He was seeing a therapist. In July, a doctor prescribed him a medication for his asthma. It was a steroid. In rare cases, this medication can cause a side effect known as steroid psychosis, a break from reality, a sudden onset of mania or paranoia. We will never know for certain if it was the medicine or a latent depression or the accumulated weight of the family history. But in the sweltering heat of July, Carter's mind began to fracture. On the night of July 21st, 1988, Carter arrived at his mother's penthouse. He was agitated. He hadn't slept in days. He told Gloria he was terrified, but he couldn't explain of what. Gloria, the eternal mother hen, tried to soothe him. She made him dinner. She sat with him. She told him he could stay with her as long as he needed. She put him to bed in his old room just like when he was a child. She thought, perhaps, that love and a good night's sleep would fix it. She thought she could protect him, just as Dodo had protected her. She went to sleep believing he was safe. But the demons that were hunting Carter Cooper did not sleep. They were waiting for the sun to rise. And when it did, they would demand a sacrifice that would make the loss of the Vanderbilt fortune look like a petty theft. The next morning, July 22nd, began like any other Friday in New York. The city was waking up. The traffic was humming on the avenues. But inside the penthouse, the air was static with tension. Carter walked into his mother's bedroom. He wasn't wearing a shirt. His eyes were wide, focused on something Gloria couldn't see. He looked at her, but he didn't seem to recognize her. "What's wrong, darling?" she asked. He didn't answer. He turned and ran, not to the door, not to the kitchen. He ran toward the terrace. The nightmare had begun. In that split second, the trajectory of the Vanderbilt dynasty shifted from the horizontal plane of success to the vertical plane of disaster. All the money earned from the denim empire, all the social standing regained after the years of scandal, and all the maternal love Gloria had poured into her sons could not stop the momentum of a mind unraveling. The sanctuary of the penthouse, which had been a fortress against the world for so long, suddenly dissolved into thin air. As Gloria chased her son toward the light of the window, she wasn't running toward a rescue. She was running toward the edge of the abyss that had been waiting for her since she was a child. The seconds that passed on the terrace of the penthouse on East 67th Street on July 22nd, 1988, were not measured in time. They were measured in heartbeats. Gloria Vanderbilt, a woman who had spent 64 years curating a world of beauty and control, found herself in a situation that was absolute, primal chaos. Her son Carter was sitting on the stone wall of the ledge. His legs were dangling over the edge. 14 stories below, the pavement of Manhattan waited. Gloria dropped to her knees. She didn't scream. Panic in its purest form often manifests as a terrible, focused calm. She spoke to him. She used the voice she had used to soothe him when he was a toddler waking from a nightmare. "Carter," she said, "come back. We can fix this. Whatever it is, we can fix it." Carter looked at her. Witnesses, or rather Gloria's own searing memory, recall that he looked confused. The fugue state induced by the medication or the psychosis had stripped away the layers of his personality. He wasn't the Princeton graduate. He wasn't the editor. He was a frightened animal who didn't know how he had gotten onto the ledge. He put up a hand, signaling her to stop. "Don't come closer." He looked down at the street. Then he looked back at his mother. In that final glance, Gloria later said she didn't see fear. She saw a moment of realization, perhaps a flicker of the Carter she knew returning just as it was too late to stop the momentum. Or perhaps she saw a goodbye. He shifted his weight. He let go. He didn't jump. He simply allowed gravity to take him. Gloria froze. She did not run to the edge to look. She knew what she would see, and she knew that if she saw it, she would follow him. She collapsed on the terrace floor, a small heap of silk and bone, while the sound of the city below changed from the hum of traffic to the rising wail of sirens. The hours that followed were a blur of police officers, sedatives, and the blinding flashbulbs of the paparazzi who had already gathered behind the yellow tape downstairs. The news traveled instantly. Gloria Vanderbilt's son jumps. It was the cruelest headline of her life. The public, hungry for the tragedy of the rich, consumed it with a voracious appetite. Anderson Cooper, her younger son, was in Washington, D.C. He got the phone call that divides a life into before and after. He drove to New York in a state of dissociation. When he arrived at the apartment, he walked into a crime scene. He saw the police. He saw the open door to the terrace, and he saw his mother. She was not the queen of jeans. She was not the socialite. She was a woman who had been hollowed out. The grief was so physical, it seemed to have altered her molecular structure. She was vibrating with a pain that was almost radioactive. For weeks, Gloria did not leave the apartment. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling. She replayed the film of the fall on a loop in her mind. She analyzed every frame. If I had run faster, if I had grabbed his ankle, if I hadn't let him take that medication. This is the bargain of the survivor. You trade your sanity for the illusion that you could have changed the outcome. But Gloria Vanderbilt was incapable of doing nothing. Even in the depths of hell, her instinct was to create. She realized that if she kept the grief inside, it would kill her. She had to externalize it. She began to make art, not the polite, decorative paintings of her earlier years, but raw, disturbing, visceral art. She created dream boxes, plexiglass cases filled with shards of pottery, doll heads, fragments of letters, and pieces of fabric. They were reliquaries of pain. She was trying to box up the chaos, to put a frame around the horror so she could look at it without being destroyed by it. She wrote a memoir called A Mother's Story. In 1996, talking about suicide was a taboo. It was considered a sin, a weakness, a shame to be hidden. Gloria broke the silence. She wrote about the medication, the confusion, the terrible helplessness. She refused to hide Carter's death behind euphemisms like accidental fall. She claimed the tragedy. By naming it, she began to strip it of its power to destroy her. The relationship between Gloria and Anderson Cooper during this time forged a bond that was stronger than steel. They were the only two left. The four musketeers, Wyatt, Gloria, Carter, Anderson, had been reduced to two. Anderson, 21 years old at the time of the suicide, dealt with his grief differently. He didn't make dream boxes. He went to war. He became a journalist. He took a camera and went to Somalia, to Rwanda, to Bosnia. He walked into famine zones and battlefields. He later admitted that he was looking for a place where the outside world matched the devastation he felt inside. He wanted to see if others were surviving the end of their worlds, just as he was surviving the end of his. Gloria didn't stop him. A different mother might have clung to her only surviving child, terrified of losing him too. But Gloria understood. She knew that safety was an illusion. She knew you couldn't protect people by keeping them home. The rainbow comes and goes, she would tell him, quoting Wordsworth. You have to ride the storm. They became a team. Anderson, the gray-haired serious anchorman, and Gloria, the eternal bohemian. They spoke every day. They had a shorthand language of shared trauma and dark humor. They were the survivors of the shipwreck, clinging to the same raft. Eventually, Gloria realized she could not stay in the apartment on East 67th Street. The terrace was always there, just outside the window. The ghost of Carter was in every room. She sold the penthouse. It was an act of exorcism. She moved to a smaller place, creating a new nest. She continued to work. She wrote novels. She painted. She even started dating again. This was the part that baffled the public. How could a woman who had seen her son die ever care about romance again? How could she wear lipstick? How could she laugh? But Gloria possessed a quality that is rare in the human species, a total lack of bitterness. She did not hate the universe for what it had done to her. She remained curious. She remained open. She fell in love again, including a later relationship with a younger man she described simply as a wonderful companion in her final years. She famously said, "I have always been in love." It wasn't about the men. It was about the state of being alive. She refused to become a stone monument to her own tragedy. She insisted on remaining flesh and blood. As the new millennium dawned, Gloria Vanderbilt entered her 80s and then her 90s. Most people at that age are invisible. Gloria became an icon for a new generation. In 2016, she and Anderson released a documentary and a book, The Rainbow Comes and Goes. It was a conversation between a mother and son. In the film, Gloria is 91. She looks frail, her face lined with the map of her history. But her eyes, those famous Vanderbilt eyes, are bright and mischievous. She talks about her lovers, Frank Sinatra, Marlon Brando, Howard Hughes. She talks about the sex, the heartbreak, the money. Anderson listens, sometimes shocked, but mostly with a look of profound admiration. The documentary revealed Gloria not as a victim, but as a warrior. She wasn't the poor little rich girl anymore. She was a woman who had taken every blow life could deliver: abandonment, abuse, theft, death, and had metabolized it into wisdom. She became an Instagram sensation. She posted pictures of her art, her fireplace, her life. Young people, millennials who had never worn her jeans, started following her. They saw in her something they craved: authenticity. Here was a woman who didn't use filters to hide the cracks. She highlighted the cracks with gold, like the Japanese art of kintsugi. But even the strongest heart eventually tires. In 2019, at the age of 95, Gloria was diagnosed with stomach cancer. She chose not to fight it with aggressive treatments. She had lived a full century. She was ready. In her final weeks, she was surrounded by the things she loved: her paintings, her friends, and Anderson. There is a video Anderson took of her in the hospital. She is laughing. They are joking about a nurse who looks like a character from a movie, even at the door of death. She was observing. She was charmed by the world. She died on June 17th, 2019. When the news broke, the obituaries listed the titles: heiress, designer, icon, mother. But the true legacy of Gloria Vanderbilt wasn't in the jeans or the trust funds. It was in the lessons she left behind. She taught us that money cannot save you, but art can. She taught us that family is not who you are born to, but who you choose to hold on to. And most importantly, she taught us that the human heart is unbreakable, not because it is hard like a diamond, but because it is fluid like water. You can slash it, you can freeze it, you can boil it, but it will always find a way to flow again. She was laid to rest in the Vanderbilt Mausoleum at the Moravian Cemetery on Staten Island, a cold monument to money and power. But unlike her ancestors, she does not lie there as a symbol of greed. She lies there alongside the memories of Wyatt and Carter, at peace. Her spirit belongs to the messy, colorful, tragic, beautiful world of the living. She is the ghost in every pair of jeans that fits just right. She is the whisper in the ear of every lonely child who dreams of a better life. She started as a pawn in a rich man's game, but she ended as the queen of her own board. She was the last swan, but unlike the others, she didn't just glide on the surface of the lake. She dove to the bottom, touched the mud, and came back up singing.